Welcome to Speaking of Jesus. Each week we hear real people having a real conversation about Jesus and what he means to them. We want to invigorate you to invite Jesus into your everyday conversations too. So, what do you want to say? This is Jessica Bordelot, and I'm here with Dr. Michael Ziegler.
Thanks for joining us. It's Easter Sunday. Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
This is the pivotal moment in the life of Christ, the life of his church. It is the moment that changes everything. His resurrection from the dead for all of us forever. Christ is risen indeed. Alleluia.
But as usual, change can bring fear. That's a big change. We'll read in the Gospel of Mark today how Jesus' followers felt as they watched him die and then couldn't find his corpse because something big had changed.
And fear can take years to overcome. Sometimes, though, it passes in a moment. We asked our guests this week to share a story of when they were afraid of something that actually turned out to be a good thing instead of a fearful one.
My name is Leah, and the title of my story is The Tough Girl Contest.
This is Jessica. My story is about stranger danger.
My name is Jared. My story is about high school.
I'm Mike, and my story is about Wolfpack 5. Leah, tell us about the Tough Girl Contest.
It's Sunday morning. My family's coming home from church. We pull into the driveway, and my oldest brother and I start to fight. And as we walk towards the house, he gets to the house first, and he slams the door in my face. And in my anger, I opened the door with a lot of force, so much so that it swung too far and the doorknob punched a hole through the wall. Brother and I both pause because we know things just got bad. So I sit in my bedroom for an hour crying because I know doom is heading my way. So I hear my dad come home. I know that they're talking about what happened, and then all of a sudden, Dad calls my brother and I into the room where he was. And so I go in there very fearful. He gave us the stereotypical stern dad talk. I'm very disappointed in the two of you, which I expected. But then he told my brother to leave the room. Now, I hated my brother at that moment, but I wanted him to stay because there needed to be a witness to what was about to happen. And I remember watching him walk out of the room and shut the door, and I just bracing myself because this was it. I was going to be in so much trouble, and I turned to look at my dad, and his demeanor had changed completely. He was smiling and shaking his head, and he started laughing, and he said, "Leah, what am I going to do with you? Enter you in some tough girl contest?" This was not the reaction I expected. And he just looked at me and said, "Get out of here." And I just said nothing and got up and walked out of the room.
That's great. The dad one-liner you never forget. What are you, in some tough girl contest? Okay, Jessica, tell us about stranger danger.
So my aunt had a family friend that she wanted to introduce me to, and she thought this would be fun. Everybody was into it. She was taking me to a breakfast to meet this guy. And immediately my stranger danger alarm goes off. He was big and imposing, and he had a loud, deep voice, and he dressed funny. And when he came to my table, I hid under the table because I had never seen Santa Claus before. And a man with a big white beard carrying around some mysterious red bag. Who is this guy, and why does he want to come talk to me? It was breakfast with Santa at some mall or something, and my aunt thought it would be fun. But no, this man was terrifying, and I was afraid of Santa Claus and wanted nothing to do with him. But then, as I got older, I discovered he brings you presents. And he seems less scary. He eats cookies, he drinks hot chocolate, he laughs a lot. So I came around, and Santa's pretty cool.
All right. It was just a passing fear.
It was a passing fear. As soon as I knew that he was going to bring me presents. I don't care if he had a loud voice and a scary beard.
Let's stop the conversation for just a moment. Jessica, this is not the first time that you've talked about Santa Claus on the show now. You brought this up earlier in the season, and you've said less than complimentary things about Santa. What's the deal? What's the deal?
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't say anything about Santa.
It wasn't quite from Elf, like you smell of beef and sit on a throne of lies.
I shared the story about my childhood trauma over the way in which I found out that Santa is not real. I mean, that's legitimate. It's not a pleasant thing to realize that adults have been feeding you baloney all your life.
I agree with that. What about Saint Nick, though? You could go with Saint Nick.
I like Santa Claus. I like Saint Nicholas. I think they both have benefits. You keep turning this into a negative feeling between me and Santa, but it's all good. I think Santa's great. If something is totally different than everything you've experienced, that difference can be scary. And so in this situation, I was scared of Santa because he's completely different than my dad. He's a marathon runner, so he's lean, he's clean-shaven, soft-spoken. He doesn't wear big red hats. He's the opposite of...
Yeah.
Right, he's opposite of this big, loud Santa Claus doing crazy things.
You're saying it takes time to get comfortable with something new.
Exactly. Okay, let's go back to the conversation and see what Jared had to say.
Jared, tell us about high school.
Yeah, I think that there's a fear of, especially when you are young, making the transition from 8th to 9th grade, that you're just like, I want to be excited. This is such a cool thing, but there is a lot of fear. And I don't know if it's just because typically at that age you're so small and there's just like these rapid developmental changes that happen.
And all the girls are a foot taller than you.
Yeah, exactly. So like I remember going to, my Lutheran high school in town and going to band camp, and I was like so afraid of like everything. Just because it's like kind of an intimidating thing. And like in reality it's like we're going to Camp Wartburg in town, and it's kind of a fun thing, and older students definitely, look out for everyone. I find myself still like having those moments to where you're like, man, like I was so afraid of doing that, but it actually turned out to be a fine thing. I often find that the things I'm most anxious about are usually the things that I like look back and I was like, that was so ridiculous that I was so fearful in that situation. So I think about like high school, and it was like, oh, that was such a great thing to go to. Like, why was I so afraid of going there? But I think that's just being a teenager.
Yeah, you just don't know until you experience it.
And all the girls are very much taller than you.
They are. That's intimidating.
They a lot of them are still taller than me. I'm not very tall.
Wolfpack 5 was the name of my squadron at the Air Force Academy where I went to college. It's a long lead up. I went to Air Force Academy football games in Colorado Springs when I was in 3rd grade through the 5th grade. We'd have season tickets, and seeing those cadets in their uniforms marching out onto the field and in their, they just look so larger than life. And I wanted to go there. And I got by the skin of my teeth, and I was just kind of always amazed that they let me in, that I was there. And it was seeing the senior cadets who were put in charge of leading their peers in this cadet wing of 4,000 people. That also seemed out of reach to me. And when I was a junior cadet, so going into my last year, someone encouraged me to interview for this job, to be the commander of this unit, a squadron, 120 fellow college students that you're supposed to kind of play military leader with. And I was not going to do it, but I had a friend who said, just do it. It doesn't matter if you're scared. Interview, and I did. I got it. It really challenged me. It really stretched me in ways that I'm so grateful for now. I don't consider myself a natural leader, but this is something that really pushed me into that space and having to lean on God and do something that really terrified me. Why do you think this it is that we're afraid of good things or good people?
Bad things have happened to us. And we've met some bad people sometimes.
Yeah, you don't know they're good in advance.
Right.
For me, grace is a really difficult concept to get. In my case, I screwed up. I deserved to have the punishment. And we've all had moments in life where you came up short on the job, or you overcommitted yourself and you couldn't deliver something that you promised to somebody. Why should they show you grace? In your example, it's you felt underqualified. Why should somebody give you a shot?
Yeah.
We don't understand grace, and that's why expect the worst.
Yeah, and maybe that's related to the grace part too, that so much of the world is retaliation, consequences coming, bad things happening when you make mistakes. And so to have a moment of grace like that is an unknown in kind of the normal course of things in the world. So some things are healthy fears. Some things it's good to have your guard up. How do you tell the difference? How do you deal with that? Fear as a thing that kind of keeps you on the road and not driving off the cliff, or fear is something that keeps you from trying a road that you really ought to go down.
Isn't that the great question of life? Bravery and stupidity have the same definition. Doing something with an unknown outcome, boldly doing something that seems very dangerous,
right.
That's courage, and that's also stupidity, right?
It wasn't until you posed this question and I was preparing for today that I realized that I handle both situations the same. Years ago, a very wise person once said to me, if you say something out loud, it starts to lose its power over you. So if you have all these fears floating around in your head, if you say it out loud, first of all, you hear yourself say it, and maybe you can talk yourself down, but then others can help you through it. And so good fear, bad fear, I talk it out. And you can talk to God about it through prayer. You can start there, but then you can, people you trust and respect, and maybe they can point out things that you don't see, good or bad.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That as soon as I started saying to people, yeah, I'm gonna apply for that job. Now it's real. Now I have to go through with it. Whereas before, when it was just in my head, it was something that I could hem and haw about and think about. But if you announce it, if you put a date on a calendar and say, this is where we're going to do it, even though I'm uncomfortable and I don't feel qualified and I'm afraid of failing. Okay, I've spoken it.
Yeah.
People can hold me accountable now.
I was thinking about how, we're now moving forward in time. So like right now, I'm in the midst of my wife being pregnant.
Woohoo,
so like
yay!
and that's a lot different than being like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have a kid sometime? And it's like, now it's a real thing, So it's like there's some actual like real steps. When it starts becoming a reality, I think that's may raise some fears and anxieties.
Now, Jared, this I know this is your second child. Can you reflect on how it was different from the first to the second? I'm assuming there were some passing fears associated with your first child. How are those passing fears different this time?
Well, one, it's not just my wife and I.
Another little person who's going to have a big change pretty soon.
Yes. So that's sort of changed our perspective.
Stakes are higher.
Yeah.
In that way, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And part of that is helping passing my daughter along through the changes that she will experience. Because I know that will be a challenging time for her. She is very used to being the only child. I know that she will do good, but this is very different.
Leah, say some more about your comment that you do the same thing for healthy fears, things you should actually avoid. You reflected that you deal with them in the same way. Say more about that.
I think if there's a challenge in front of me or something that concerns me, and it's looking like it might be dangerous or something I shouldn't do. The same wise person who said, say it out loud, also said, fear is not a decision maker. It's a piece of information. And we use it as a decision maker in life. We say, I'm scared of this, therefore I won't do it. Instead of saying, I'm scared, why? And then examining the facts and talking it through with people. And then you can come to solid conclusions, but we can't just say, I'm afraid, therefore I won't do this. You have to examine it.
Right. Healthy fear leads to caution, not paralysis.
Until you speak those things, until you have a conversation with other people about those things, it's all just in your head and it becomes the decision driving factor.
And in your head is an odd place to be sometimes because things can get out of control very quickly.
It's like a boiling pot with a cover on it. It's going crazy, but if you take the lid off, some of the steam goes away.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Gospel of Mark. We've been in this book for many weeks now, and we've come to the ending. The Gospel of Mark talks about fear in this way. It's interesting. It's the only time Mark uses the word fear is in this passing fear of something that's good, specifically the thing that God is doing. Every time Mark uses the word fear in that sense, it's always a normal reaction to what God is doing in Jesus. So I'll give you some examples here. When Mark tells us that the disciples were afraid of Jesus because he stilled the storm. So there was fear there. There was fear when he drove the demons out of the man in the Gerasenes. The people were afraid of him. When he was walking on the water, they were afraid of him. When the woman felt that power came out from him and healed her, she was afraid. They're afraid when they're walking up to Jerusalem. There's fear that the Bible talks about that's not good, that we need to get rid of. It's fear of bad things, and those are that's a different kind of fear. Mark's talking about this initial reaction to the good thing that God is doing. So listen to this last section of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 37 through 16:8. And listen for this. It ends with fear. It ends with fear. So listen for that, but also another word that gets your attention in some way. And Jesus, upon sending out a great shout, expired. He breathed out the Spirit. And the curtain of the temple sanctuary split in two from top to bottom. And the centurion, who was standing there facing him, when he saw that in this way he breathed out the Spirit, said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." And some women were there, observing from a distance. Among them were both Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, the mother of Joseph, and Salome. When Jesus was in Galilee, they would follow him and serve him, along with many other women, those who had come up to Jerusalem with him. Now it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. And since evening was approaching, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable member of the Jewish ruling council, who was also awaiting the rule and reign of God, he took courage and went into Pilate, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and he requested the body of Jesus. Pilate was amazed to hear that he was already dead. And upon summoning a centurion, he asked if he had just died. And when he learned from the centurion that it was so, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And since Joseph had bought a linen cloth, he took down the body and wrapped it in the linen and placed it in a tomb which had been cut from the rock formation, and he rolled a stone over the entrance. And Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph observed where he was placed and was now there. After the Sabbath had passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might come to the tomb and anoint him. And on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they come to the tomb after the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, who's going to roll the stone away from the tomb for us? And when they looked up, they see that the stone was already rolled away. It was very large, you know. And after they had entered into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right-hand side, dressed in a white robe. And they were alarmed. And he says to them, "Don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus from Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He is arisen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And upon going out, they fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had them in its grip. And they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid, you know?
Okay, let's pause before we hear what our guests have to say, because most Bible translations I've used have a little line at the end of chapter 16 and a note that says something like, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20. And then there's an extra 12 verses after the ones that you just read. So what's going on with that?
That's a great observation. And a lot of people run across this as they start paying attention to those notes in their Bibles. With Mark specifically, there's disagreement about those last 12 verses. On the one hand, everything that we read there, the historic details, they're all recorded in other accounts of the life of Jesus. So the gospel according to Matthew, Luke, John, the book of Acts. So there's no controversy about the events that Jesus did rise from the dead. He did meet his disciples in Jerusalem. He also later met them in Galilee. It's just that some of the earliest copies of Mark's gospel don't have those last 12 verses, verses 9 through 20. The book just ends at verse 8, where we ended the reading.
But there are other manuscripts that include more of the events that occurred after the resurrection. Like you were saying, the ascension into heaven, final instructions. But at that point, the disciples are no longer quietly afraid. They're going out, they're preaching everywhere, they're sharing the good news. I always liked that ending better because it takes you past like the fear and trembling part. It starts you on this courageous road of witness, sharing what God has done. I don't know why Mark would end with Jesus' followers running away scared.
And that's honestly one of the reasons why some people think that those additional 12 verses were part of the original writing that Mark authored. On the other hand, though, many manuscripts end at 16 verse 8. There are church fathers, in fact, who comment on this, that there are longer endings of Mark that they don't think are original. There's also the fact that the style doesn't match in those last 12 verses that you see in the rest of the book, chapter 1 through 16 verse 8. And so some people conclude that someone else, maybe just a well-meaning Christian, for reasons like you just mentioned, added those last 12 verses in as an addendum.
I'm not a scholar of the original languages, so I can't make any kind of an expert opinion, but just as which one I liked better, it's always been, I like the story arcs that have a long ending. I want to know what happens at the end and give me some resolution.
I agree with you. And so if you want that longer arc, go read Matthew, go read John, Analyzing the writing, the style doesn't match. In verses 9 through 20, it doesn't match with the rest of the book. For example, a Greek pronoun that's used in a certain way that happens many times, 3 or 4 times in verses 9 through 20, that's never used at all in the rest of the book. There's his use of participles that's different. My teacher, Jim Veltz, he's very strong on this, and he thinks that Mark originally ended at 16 verse 8. He says that the Greek profile of Mark 16, 9 through 20 is very different than anything that you read in the rest of the book. He's convinced me. I think Mark intended to end right where he did. But again, it doesn't give us anything to worry about the authenticity of Scripture because, again, the events and the teachings of those last 12 verses, they're recorded all throughout the New Testament. Jesus promises protection on his followers. There's even a case where Paul gets bitten by a snake and he doesn't die in the book of Acts. And so these teachings and events really happened, and they're recorded throughout the New Testament. And the New Testament as a whole is based on solid manuscript evidence that's more solid than any other collection of written documents in the ancient world. I just don't think that's how Mark ended his book. And I think he's got a compelling reason to end where he did. And sometimes that gets overlooked.
You just ended the reading with this final sentence. And upon going out of the tomb, they fled because trembling and astonishment had them in its grip. And they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid.
What was a word or a phrase that got your attention?
Who will roll away the stone?
Leah, that was mine too. I'm not going to change it. I'm sticking with you.
I would say, do not be alarmed, you seek.
Okay, for me, it was the word corpse, how Jesus' body is described as a corpse. Yeah, Jessica, why did Who Will Roll Away the Stone for us stand out to you?
I love that these women were planners, and it shows. You take note of where Jesus is buried. You make sure the spices are ready. You plan to wake up early. Everything that they could control, they did. Even though they were scared, you talk it through, you make your plans. But the one thing that they couldn't control, because they couldn't physically pull it off, was moving this stone. And in the account of that day, this is the first fear that they come across. And in the grand scheme of things, it's the smallest. They don't know what's coming next or what they're going to be afraid of. And what do you know? It's already handled.
Mark switches to the historical present at that moment. They're talking, and it's all in the kind of the past tense, and then they come to the tomb and see, present tense, they see that the stone had already been rolled away.
I think that question hit me because Mark is full of rhetorical or teaching questions. There are so many accounts that Mark includes of Jesus teaching people by asking questions, right? Now, who do you say that I am? But Jesus asks questions, and not because he needs an answer, but because that's how he teaches. We talked last week, even on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That wasn't a question that he was looking for an answer, but perhaps wanted us to think about.
Yeah, and when the rich man comes to Jesus, he asks, what do you want me to do for you? Why do you call me good? You're exactly right. He's always asking questions.
The woman who he healed, who secretly touched his robe, he turns around, he's like, who touched my clothing? He knows everything. He's God. But he uses questions to teach us.
In the boat also, he asks him, why are you so afraid?
Yes. So he's a good teacher, so he uses questions to allow people to learn. And I think this is another time that Mark is pointing out a question by which we can learn, right? The women are like, who will roll the stone away? Well, who will roll the stone away? Who's going to remove the separation that we have from God? And then they get there and there is no more separation. It's gone. Life is in that tomb and God's messenger is in that tomb. There's nothing that's going to stop us from God anymore because Jesus has removed the sin that's in the way and fixed our relationship with God. So it's like there's no separation. The curtain's torn.
So much in our worldly sense, it's just fear of death, and that's gone too. That's what that stone represents. Death is here, but no, it's gone too. Jared, what was it about you seek Jesus of Nazareth?
Hearing the phrase, do not be alarmed, you seek Jesus of Nazareth, it's just really encapsulating being there, sort of exposed of what they were doing. A moment to where seeking Jesus of Nazareth, and they don't even really know sort of like the depth of what those words mean. And that's just like so like deep right there. I feel very exposed and humble thinking about like, if I was in that situation, I'm, approaching a tomb, looking for a corpse, the scene be not what I expected it to be, but something even better. I think there's a level of fear that I think there's even a higher level of fear that you're like, well, like I was already scared and now I don't even think this is beyond what I expected to happen, and then just to say, oh, this is actually like somehow good news.
I like how you say that there's being afraid, but then there's even this, you're so afraid that you don't even know how to be afraid. It's so out of the realm of possible expectation. It's a corpse. It's a body. And that's what they're expecting, even though they honor this body and this corpse so highly. And then to have somebody say, you seek Jesus of Nazareth. It's a perfect tense verb, the one who is crucified. So not was crucified, the one who is and remains the crucified one, the one who was shamed and powerless and dead and buried. He still bore all of that, but he's not here. He's alive. He's risen. That's a different kind of fear because it breaks through what you thought was possible. Yeah, and that's why the word corpse really stands out to me.
Well, that astonished fear of death being undone, it was a different Greek word. Now, I don't know Greek, but I was reading in a commentary that the same word for they were astonished after they couldn't find Jesus was the same as when Jesus raised the little girl. And everyone was astonished. It's like this extra fear, like, well, this is way beyond anything. Like, undoing death is beyond any kind of a unexpected different thing that we could imagine.
I just love how Mark gives us a little breather after the intensity of the crucifixion scene breaks away and says, and let me tell you about these women. They used to follow him. They used to serve him. And many others came up to Jerusalem with him. It's like he knows that we need a break after the crucifixion. And it's in some ways a preview that this mission, this ministry isn't over. He's not just talking about it as something that's gone forever, but yeah, they served him, they followed him.
It's this conversation that makes me think differently about how God will sustain all of us. So Jared, you started talking about, can you imagine these women? Because I kept thinking they're just operating on fumes at this point. They're exhausted and they've walked up to the tomb and things aren't going well. They got nothing left in the tank. And then all of a sudden, yep, it can get even crazier. And it did. But like you said, Dr. Ziegler, they're given some direction, something to do. And they suddenly have the energy to do it. They haven't come to the end of their rope. So God giving them what they need to keep on going that day, it's neat.
And to go to Galilee, that's a trek. That's 90 miles from Jerusalem. There's lots of steps that have to take. And he just puts the promise out there. There you'll see him. But go to Galilee. Now, from the other gospel accounts, we know that Jesus met them there in Jerusalem. But again, it's that giving them the next thing to move forward. You need to travel back to Galilee, back north, and there you'll see him. What are you getting to know more deeply about the way our God works through this? For me, it's just normalizes fear. I feel like fear should not be a part of my life, but at least on this side of the return of Jesus, this just kind of helps me normalize it. Okay, you're going to be afraid. That's normal.
We've been talking this whole time about how God uses fear and how when we're in the presence of God, we're afraid, even though he is good and he brings good out of it, but he's not going to leave you in fear either. His perfect love drives out fear. Their fear gave way to joy. The fear that the people had when they saw the little girl be raised from the dead led to joy. And ours is going to too. He's not going to leave us in fear. We don't need to be, that we'll be afraid to meet God, that we'll be afraid to spend eternity with him, because he's going to turn all this fear into joy. It's maybe useful, but it's not where we live.
We should expect fear. We should also know that it's not permanent. It's not going to last. That fear isn't where God wants to leave us. Fear gets your attention. There's nothing like finding out you're going to be a father for the first time. Jared can testify, or do something you've never done before. Your dad smile at you and you're expecting him to bring down the hammer. It gets your attention.
I think it's really cool to think about how Jesus sometimes is even working through our past. For them in the Gospel of Mark, it was watching him die and, seeing a lifeless body be taken off the cross. I don't think I've had something as tragic happen directly in my life. But I mean, there are some really great things that I could look back and say that, Jesus was able to sort of work with those and bring even fulfillment to those very dark things that could consume you with fear for their future.
How does this speak good news to you now with whatever it is that you're potentially afraid of?
I think knowing that fear isn't an indication that something is wrong. Fear should be a caution sign and not a stop sign. We can be afraid to come to God because of our sin, but that shouldn't stop us. We can be afraid of what life is bringing at us, but that shouldn't paralyze us. We could be afraid of what we might have to give up for the sake of Christ, but that shouldn't paralyze us. None of these things are indicators that something is wrong, but pay attention, see what's going on, and know that it's temporary.
Fear is a pay attention sign. It's a see what God's doing sign.
Yeah, I think that Jessica was saying, we don't have to be consumed with fear. And not only do we not have to be consumed with it, we can really start to take those things to Jesus. Jesus will sort of work with us on those things to where even the times that our fears totally consume us, he's still going to be there working through that.
Again, we don't know what's behind that door, what's behind that bend in the road. Leah, the wise person that you listened to said about fear that it's a piece of information. So it's good news to me that though I don't have all the information, I know I'm afraid, but I don't know what's behind the next door. I don't know what's on the other side of that crest in the hill. Whatever is in between me and the next thing, is got his arms around all of it, even death. And so that helps me do the next thing that Jesus has given me to do. Go to Galilee. I can tend to the details, and it helps me speak over those fears.
And what I have spent my life being afraid of is so minor and trivial. And since we're talking about the resurrection today, we have a God that handled the biggest thing of all, eternal damnation for all of us. So if he took care of the big stuff, of course he's going to take care of the small stuff in my life too. And I can move forward confidently with that in mind. There's no detail that he hasn't looked at.
Well, how about we just end with this? Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. Okay, Mike, you totally got me this time.
What?
In the past, I've always thought that the shorter ending to the book of Mark, I thought it was too abrupt. It wasn't compelling. Why would they end in the middle of chaos, right? I think maybe that's exactly what the author wanted us to think about, to let us know that feeling afraid doesn't mean that something is wrong, that God has abandoned us. It can just mean that something new is coming, that change is happening. And he leaves you there and lets you know that it's okay that you're still there. And you think about this for yourself. I love it. I'm all about the story arc ending there, and that Mark is like this master storyteller that has kind of led you on this road with a purpose and includes these details and a purpose to ask, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Throughout the whole book. And then at the end, the centurion says he's the Son of God, and the disciples are afraid. And it's almost like you finish reading Mark and it's like, who do you say that he is?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. It's not just they were afraid. The last word of the book of Mark is the Greek word gar, which it's kind of a particle. It's an aside. So, and they were afraid, Like, what do you say? What are you going to do? Or what are you doing with this news about Jesus? That he's alive, he's risen, you go to Galilee, you'll see him, just like he told you. So it ends with a promise. You don't get to see it. You have to trust before you get to see. And that's the whole theme of the book of Mark. So yes, Jesus is risen from the dead. This changes everything. And if he is risen from the dead and he is who he says he is, then you can take him at his word. His word is sure, even if you don't get to see it just yet. All this way, Mark has been telling us how Jesus is the Messiah that God promised from centuries earlier, that he is the one who took our punishment, our sin, our death onto himself, that he is the sacrificial covering. He rises from the dead, he defeats death, and we can take him at his word. Trusting him in faith, we live in him with God forever. His resurrection changes everything.
But change can be scary. Even good change. Even this amazingly good change. It might not feel safe to trust that Jesus is who he said he is. Because if it's true, you might change. You might let go of things that you thought you couldn't live without. Self-sufficiency, approval of other people, feeling like you are a good person. Or even like those habits that make you feel safe. Leaving those things behind can be a scary thought.
And if that's where you're at, it's okay. It doesn't mean that something bad is happening. It means that God is doing something new in you. I promise, the fear will pass. Death will be over. Only life will remain. Eternal life. Life without a trace of pain, without hurt, without death, without fear.
And God tells us what's coming next. It's in Revelation 21. He says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who is seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new.
Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Thanks for being a part of the conversation. If you want to see the faces behind the voices you heard today, join our Facebook group called Speaking of Jesus. Every week there are new pictures and opportunities to interact with other listeners.
There's lots of past episodes that you could listen to on our website. That's jesuspodcast.org. You can find us wherever podcasts are found. And if you find us there, leave us a rating, leave us a review. It helps.
Next week, we'll talk about communes. How long could you last sharing a house with another family? What if it was 2 other families? Join us and see what we have to say. We pray that this week's podcast has encouraged you in your faith and has invigorated you to speak of his love into the lives of those around you. See you next week. As always, we'll hear from Dr. Ziegler in a real conversation between real people speaking of Jesus. What do you want to say? You love it when I write in arguments. I get to see you kind of light up like, oh, what mean thing can I say to Jessica today?